What's going on, family? Let's talk today about expectations. And so I'm sitting here with my notebook, my I'm Not Your Pastor notebook, and this is the thing that I write down things that I'm thinking about or working on or focusing on. This is what I write down things in. And the latest thing that I wrote down was about expectations. And so as I think about the expectations I have, typically my expectations wildly vary depending on the person, the relationship, how long I've known them, um, whether I'm rested, whether I'm hungry or hangry, or what's going on in my day, what part of the day, what my spiritual, emotional, physical, financial needs of the moment are. And so sometimes I have very low expectations of people as to not be disappointed. And other times I have very high expectations of people. And I find that that usually is a pretty good recipe to get me in trouble. I have expectations of people, of relationships, of circumstances. I have expectations of God. I have all these sort of expectations. And sometimes they pan out, and sometimes they don't. And so I thought on this episode of I'm Not Your Pastor, we would talk about having appropriate expectations that are actually helpful and that are not hurtful spiritually, mentally, emotionally, physically, um, and that we don't create our own trauma out of misplaced or misguided emotion. So here's one of the first things that I wrote. I wrote under expectations that the fastest route to unhappiness is through expectation. You know, one of the things when I think about other traditions other than Christianity, this is one thing that the Buddhists tend to do so much better than us Christians is alleviate attachments and expectations. And this is really foundational in their belief system. And I think it's something that we could, if we paid a bit of attention and if we were careful about the things that work in our traditions and the things that tend to not work so well in our tradition, this is something that we could really learn from. And this is something that I've really learned from, especially from that particular tradition. But, you know, when we think about people and things that we have expectations for, like, and by the way, sidebar here, this is something that I deal with on a daily basis because I like my expectations. I want control. I want to be able to expect people to respond and react in certain ways. And when they don't, I want to address it. But the problem is that really sort of puts me in the position of God and not in the position of me. And so when I think about the expectations I have, a lot of times I've got expectations for how my family may respond to things. I have expectations for what things my clients and my customers might do. I've got expectations of my significant other. I've got expectations of my children and their behavior. And then when those expectations aren't met, I tend to get mad, hurt, angry, frustrated, and all these different things. And so when I think about the types of expectations, the hurtful and the helpful types of expectations I have, typically I find that there's really only two types of expectations. There are only overt expectations and there are covert expectations. So here's the difference. Overt expectations means they're out in the open. They're there for everyone to see and understand equally. These are things that are an agreement between you and I. You know what the expectation is. I know what the expectation is. They're overt. The other kind, here's the damaging ones. The other kind are covert expectations. These are the ones that I have this expectation of your behavior, of your response, of your thought process, of your worldview, of whatever. I have some sort of an expectation for you, but I don't tell you. But then when you don't meet that expectation, I punish you. Is this starting to sound familiar to you? This is something that I do. This is something I think all of us do at some point and at some level. And I find that those covert expectations can be really, really traumatizing, not only for us personally, but also for the people that we're in relationship with, the people that we're in line with at the grocery store, and every other person in between. And the more we really focus on taking those covert expectations and either eliminating the expectation altogether or moving them from covert to overt, the more we're able to do that, the more successful we can be in our relationships, in our businesses, in our social life, in our family structure and dynamic. And so, if you're wondering, how do you take a covert expectation and translate it or transfer it into an overt expectation? Here's what I've found. I have found that it really takes two things. First, it takes the confidence to have the conversation, because an overt expectation is really an agreement between two people or an agreement between a group of people. And so we have to take it out of the dark and into the light. And so it takes a certain amount of confidence, not only in yourself, but also in your ability, which is the second thing, which is a skill. So it takes confidence to have the conversation, and then it takes skill to have a conversation that's skillful enough to have a discourse that's healthy and that creates and builds something instead of tearing something down. Sometimes I've been really good at this. Other times I've been really, really bad at this. And it tends to happen with the relationships that I care the most about. I'm much more likely to have covert expectations over my children, my wife, my parents, the people that I love the most. And I'm much less likely to have any expectation at all for people that aren't in that circle. I just sort of give people a bit of the benefit of the doubt. And so there's a couple of guidelines that I've tried to hold myself to that could perhaps be helpful for you. And here, so let me share them with you. There's only three. The first one is let people be themselves, their flaws and all. Just let people be themselves, because just like you, just like your parents, just like the person walking down the street, every single person on the planet who has lived, is living, and will ever live is simply doing the best they can with what they have in the moment. And no one is on purpose trying to be the worst version of themselves. There may be a few exceptions that you find, but in general, most people are doing the best they can with what they have, even when they're acting poorly or even when they're behaving badly. They're still doing the absolute best they can with what they have to work with. And so just recognizing that in people and going, gosh, that's the best they can give me. And sometimes that can drive a bit of compassion and a bit of understanding when someone behaves badly with us, to say, gosh, instead of saying they should change, they've disrespected me, I've got to make them pay, I've got to point that out. Instead of doing all of that garbage, just stopping for long enough to say to yourself, it must be awful to have a state of mind that would cause a person to behave that way. And allow yourself to have a bit of compassion for the other person. So that's something that's been really helpful for me, is just letting people be people, like letting people be human and make mistakes and be flawed. And I've never found it to be helpful to be critical or to call someone out in public, or especially when they're in that state of mind, when they're behaving badly. People typically aren't receptive to feedback. And so calling them out in the moment typically isn't the best way. Sometimes maybe, there's an exception to everything, but most of the time, people are not receptive to your feedback and your wisdom and your understanding and all of in your advice when they're in a negative mental or emotional state, when they're behaving badly. And so most of the time it's better to wait and just allow time to play it out, and then decide afterwards if you need that confidence and skill, if you need to deploy that to have a deeper conversation about realigning an expectation with that person. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, this is a piece of advice that Dale Carnegie gave a really long time ago. And this is one of his stress principles, which is simply this: expect ingratitude. And so one of the ways I like to think about that, because I'm in general a pretty optimistic person. I like to think the best about people, and I like to expect the best from people. But the reality is when I expect that, when I have this super high expectation and people don't meet that expectation, then I feel disenfranchised or let down. And it doesn't have to be like that. That's something I'm learning, that it does not have to be that way. And so one of the ways that I've changed that is I've just started to expect ingratitude in general. And so I still believe the best about people, but I expect something a bit less. And so when I get more, I'm really happy. I can feel even more grateful than I would have before. But when I'm expecting everyone to be held at this standard, or to be, and usually what happens, and I mean, really, isn't that we hold people to a high standard. What it means is we hold people to an unrealistic standard that we would like to achieve, instead of a realistic standard so here's the thing about accountability. Accountability is really two words. It's account and ability. So the more we start to really account for the ability of the other person, instead of giving them some unrealistic expectation, we start accounting for the ability of the person, we're able to give them a bit more grace and a bit more understanding and a bit more compassion, so that we can deepen the relationship. Because the truth is the deeper our relationships, the more direct our conversations can be. And many times we want to adjust our expectations of someone, or we want to adjust their behavior before we've really earned the right through the relationship to be able to have a conversation that direct with that person. So expecting ingratitude is the second thing. Here's the third thing. Recognize that people are doing the best they can. People are just doing the best they can. It's really easy. And I'm doing that, you're doing that. I think everyone's doing that. And so one of the ways to keep that top of mind is to insert a bit of curiosity. Because one of the things that I've found for myself is when I'm curious as to why other people think the way they think, or do the things they do, or behave the way they behave, the more curious I am, the least judgmental. But here's the thing, it works the other way as well, because the more judgmental I am, the less curious I become. So I believe, and my experience has illustrated this, that when I'm curious, I'm never judgmental. But when I'm judgmental, I'm never curious. And so the more I'm able to insert curiosity over judgment, and say, gosh, I wonder why they did that. I wonder what else is at play here. I wonder what else is going on in their life. The more I'm able to do that, the more I understand, the more compassion I have, the more empathy it drives, and the more able I am to have a non-emotionally heated conversation, to just ask, hey, are you okay? Is everything going okay? It seemed as if that behavior was a bit out of character for you. What's going on? Instead of judging the behavior and going and knocking them over the head. Because the truth is when I act that way, and I do, and so do you, when I act outside of my character, or when I act as the worst version of myself, I really want people to come to me and ask me, yo, like, is everything okay? Because one of the things I found in my work is the people that are the most unlovable are the people that need love the most. The people that are the least compassionate are the people that need compassion the most, because there's something just under the surface that we don't see, that we don't understand. And the more willing we are to approach them with curiosity, the least likely we are to harm them or ourselves with a judgmental spirit. And here's the final thing. The final thing is there's no such thing as good or bad people anyway. There's only joyful people and miserable people. And that's what drives people's behavior. And the truth is we're both consistently, because when I'm joyful, I do the sort of behaviors that joyful people do. But when I'm miserable, I typically do the behaviors that miserable people do. And so it's recognizing that just because they're behaving badly, it's not about me. is probably about something that's going on with them. So the question is this a boundary that I must set up for myself? Or is this a conversation I must have? Do I need to realign my expectations? Do I need to ask them what my expectations should be? Or do I just let them be human and move on? And that's something that we have to constantly sort of calibrate to figure out. But the fewer expectations we can have on people and circumstances and scenarios and issues and relationships just in general, I believe the happier we can become. And this also translates to how we see God and our relationship with God, because for a lot of my life, I've had a unrealistic expectation of God in general, and I haven't accepted who God is, what God's up to, and addressed it with curiosity. Instead, I've judged it. And I've said, gosh, I don't understand why God did this. I don't understand why God allowed that. I don't understand why God let this thing happen to me, or why God didn't stop this other thing. Instead of addressing it with just a bit of curiosity and saying, man, I wonder why. What is it? And being more curious than judgmental. And so my encouragement to you today and in this episode is really to consider, are you leading your expectations with curiosity, or are you leading your expectations with judgment? And if someone is out of line and requires a conversation, are you addressing them with the confidence and the skills to build the relationship, or are you simply addressing to break them down so that you can have more control? I believe that's a worthwhile thing to interrogate in each of us. And the more we do that, and the more we interrogate ourselves with curiosity, I believe the fewer expectations we'll have. And the fewer expectations we have, the more positive outcomes, relationships, and environments we'll have an opportunity to be a part of. Grace and peace, people.